Some launch titles do more than sell a console. They draw a line in the sand. Super Mario 64, Halo, Ridge Racer, Soul Calibur. Games that arrive alongside new hardware and immediately convince players the old generation belongs in a museum besides agricultural tools and dinosaur bones. Rogue Leader was one of those games. Released alongside the GameCube in 2001, it looked impossible. Even today, there are moments where the visual design still holds remarkable power. The dramatic lighting, the film-inspired colour grading, the sheer density of combat. Explosions blooming across the surface of Star Destroyers, while laser fire cuts through fields of floating debris. And then there was Hoth. The Battle of Hoth in Rogue Leader felt like childhood memories suddenly rendered playable. Snow spraying beneath the belly of your snowspeeder, AT-ATs stomping through blinding blizzards, John Williams' iconic score hammering through the speakers while the battlefield erupted in every direction. It captured massive scale without sacrificing control. More importantly, Rogue Leader refined the series rather than reinventing it. The foundation remained intact. The missions were tighter, the presentation richer, the flying smoother. Even its difficulty, notorious as it could sometimes be, reinforced the game's identity. Gold medals demanded mastery. Players learned routes, enemy placements, and perfect timing with almost arcade-like precision. It became a high-score chase, disguised as cinematic spectacle, and people adored it. At the time, Rogue Leader represented the GameCube at its absolute best. Nintendo's purple lunchbox was often dismissed as the weaker console in the 6th generation horsepower race. Yet here was Factor 5 producing visuals that left jaws on the floor, which created a dangerous situation. Because success breeds confidence, confidence breeds ambition, and ambition often develops a mild allergy to restraint. By the time Rebel Strike entered development, Factor 5 had become one of LucasArts' premier technical teams. And technically speaking, Rebel Strike is still astonishing. The opening minutes alone announce a game operating with enormous confidence. Massive battles erupt immediately, ships swarm across richly detailed environments, explosions light entire landscapes. The cinematic presentation lunges toward Hollywood's spectacle with the enthusiasm of a director who has just discovered unlimited pyrotechnics. In screenshots and trailers, the game looked extraordinary. But beneath that visual spectacle sat a creative decision that changed everything. Factor 5 no longer wanted Rogue Squadron to be purely about flying. On paper, the logic made sense. The Star Wars fantasy is broader than spacecraft. Players love lightsaber duels, blaster firefights, speeder chases, and epic ground battles on Endor. Expanding gameplay variety probably sounded like natural progression. Why remain confined to cockpits when Star Wars itself spans entire galaxies of action? The problem is not difficult to identify in hindsight. Rogue Squadron's greatest strength was focus, and Rebel Strike fractures that focus almost immediately. There is an almost unmistakable tonal shift the first time Rebel Strike pulls you from a vehicle and hands you a blaster. The energy changes. Not because on-foot gameplay is inherently wrong for Star Wars. Plenty of excellent Star Wars games centre entirely around ground combat. Republic Commando understood squad tactics beautifully. Battlefield captured large-scale warfare, and Jedi Knight gave players lightsabers sharp enough to carve through keyboards. But Rebel Strike's ground combat feels imported from another game entirely, and not a particularly strong one. Movement lacks precision, shooting feels awkward and floaty, enemy encounters quickly become repetitive. The camera often struggles to support the pace the missions demand. What had once been a flowing arcade experience now repeatedly grinds against clumsy firefights that feels years behind contemporary action games. This was 2003. Players had already experienced Halo. They had played Max Payne. They knew what polished third-person and first-person combat could feel like. Rebel Strike simply could not compete in that arena, and yet the game insists upon it constantly. Entire missions become bogged down in on-foot sequences that interrupt the rhythm Rogue Squadron once mastered. Momentum evaporates. You stop feeling like an elite pilot carved through impossible battles and start feeling like someone standing in line at a government office, only you happen to be holding a blaster rifle. What makes this especially frustrating is how frequently the game reminds you what it could have been, because the flying sections remain genuinely thrilling. Every so often, Rebel Strike suddenly snaps back into focus. You launch into a massive space battle, the orchestral score swells, TIE fighters flood the screen, laser fire tears across the atmosphere, and for a few glorious minutes, the game becomes Rogue Squadron again. Those moments still work beautifully. The controls remain fundamentally solid during flight. The ships handle with enough responsiveness to maintain that arcade immediacy the series depended upon. Dogfights retain an exhilarating rhythm when the missions give you room to simply fly and destroy. Certain recreations from the films are genuinely spectacular. The Death Star trench run sequences remain thrilling. The Battle of Endor carries remarkable visual density. Space engagements feel appropriately chaotic without descending into unreadable clutter. Even today, there are sections where Rebel Strike demonstrates why Factor 5 earns such admiration. The audio design alone deserves high praise. Engines roar with mechanical aggression. Turbo lasers thunder through surround sound. John Williams' music elevates even weaker encounters with operatic urgency. And visually, Rebel Strike pushed the GameCube astonishingly hard. Factor 5's engineering wizardry became legendary for good reason. Through custom tools and obsessive optimization, they squeezed results from Nintendo's hardware that often looked like a game running one console generation ahead, which only deepens the tragedy. Because the core competence never disappeared, the developers still understood spectacle, they still understood Star Wars presentation, they still knew how to craft thrilling aerial combat. They simply stopped trusting that it was enough. There is a recurring illness in sequel design, the belief that escalation automatically equals improvement. More mechanics, more genres, more systems, more variety. As though the audience will grow restless unless constantly distracted by novelty. Rebel Strike suffers from this profoundly. The game introduces multiple gameplay styles, not because the existing formula failed, but because the developers feared that refinement alone might appear insufficiently ambitious. And this mindset quietly damages pacing throughout the campaign. The original Rogue Squadron games understood the elegance of specialization. They focused relentlessly on delivering one fantasy extremely well. Rebel Strike instead behaves like a studio showcase reel, eager to demonstrate every possible mechanic, whether or not those mechanics strengthen the experience. Vehicle transitions become increasingly frequent. Mission structures fragment, some objectives feel stitched together from competing ideas rather than designed around a coherent gameplay flow. At times, the campaign resembles a buffet assembled by someone terrified the guests might become bored before reaching dessert. And ironically, the result becomes exhausting rather than expensive. The game rarely settles long enough for players to sink into mastery. Just as you adjust to one gameplay mode, Rebel Strike drags you into another. Variety replaces rhythm, spectacle replaces refinement, and eventually, the identity of the series begins dissolving beneath the weight of its own ambitions. The best new ideas in Rebel Strike enhance flying, the weakest ideas replace it. And somewhere in there lies the entire lesson of the game. Licensed games occupy a dangerous creative space. Studios are rarely adapting mechanics. The temptation to combine everything into one ultimate experience is enormous. Rebel Strike feels consumed by that temptation. Factor 5 seemingly looked at the Star Wars universe and decided Rogue Squadron should evolve into a broader cinematic platform rather than remain a focused flight action series. But audiences often connect most deeply with games that narrow their scope rather than expand it. Arkham Asylum worked because it concentrated on being Batman within tightly controlled spaces. Burnout mastered vehicular chaos for a singular focus. Ace Combat becomes beloved by embracing arcade flight combat wholeheartedly instead of apologising for it. Rogue Squadron once understood this instinctively. Rebel Strike forgot. At launch, reviews for Rebel Strike were respectable rather than disastrous. Many outlets praised the visuals extensively. Some admired the ambition. The cooperative features received attention, and because the Star Wars presentation remained powerful, the game carried enough spectacle to impress players initially. But criticism appeared consistently around the same issue, the on-foot sections. Reviewers repeatedly identified them as awkward interruptions, dragging down the core experience. Even sympathetic coverage acknowledged that Rebel Strike worked best when airborne. Over time, that criticism hardened into consensus. Today, when people revisit the game, discussions almost always orbit the same frustration. Players remember moments of brilliance interrupted by mechanics that never should have occupied so much of the spotlight. The disappointment became clearer in retrospect, because the series effectively stalled afterwards. Rebel Strike did not kill Rogue Squadron instantly, but it marked the moment the franchise lost its creative clarity. And once that clarity disappeared, momentum vanished with it. After Rebel Strike, the Rogue Squadron series largely faded away. Factor 5 continued experimenting with technology and ambitious projects, but the industry itself was shifting. Development costs rose dramatically. Licensed games became increasingly volatile. There were attempts to revive the spirit of Rogue Squadron in various forms. Rumours surfaced periodically. Spiritual successors emerged elsewhere, yet the series itself never fully recovered its prominence. And that absence still feels strange, because arcade flight combat never truly disappeared as a genre. It merely became unfashionable among major publishers. Ace Combat persisted, smaller studios carried the torch. Players continued demonstrating affection for accessible, high-energy aerial combat when given the opportunity. Which raises an uncomfortable possibility. Perhaps Rogue Squadron did not need reinvention at all. Perhaps refinement would have been enough. Imagine an alternative version of Rebel Strike. No awkward ground combat, no identity crisis, no compulsive need to become every Star Wars fantasy simultaneously. Instead, imagine Factor 5 doubling down on what already worked. Larger, more dynamic space battles, smarter mission design with branching objectives, expanded co-op throughout, deeper ship variety and customization, dynamic weather and environmental hazards that change mid-mission. A game entirely committed to being the definitive cinematic arcade flight experience. The tragedy is that the technology already existed, the presentation already existed, the talent certainly existed. You can see glimpses of that hypothetical masterpiece buried throughout Rebel Strike, like fragments from a parallel timeline. And that may be why the game remains fascinating, rather than forgettable. Forgettable failures usually collapse completely. Rebel Strike never does. It hovers frustratingly close to greatness for long stretches before sabotaging itself with another clumsy detour through mechanics nobody truly came for. Playing Rebel Strike now creates a peculiar emotional rhythm. Admiration, frustration, admiration again. The visuals remain impressive relative to the hardware. The soundtrack still carries enormous cinematic force. Some missions genuinely capture the exhilaration of Star Wars space combat better than modern titles with budgets 10 times larger. Then suddenly, you are stumbling through another on-foot section, wondering how the same developers responsible for those extraordinary flight battles approved combat this stiff. The contrast is jarring. Yet, there is also something strangely honest about the game. Rebel Strike reflects an era when developers believed bigger experiences represented inevitable progress. The early 2000s were filled with sequels, attempting to expand mechanically in every direction simultaneously. Sometimes that ambition produced masterpieces. Sometimes it produced games that forgot their own center. Rebel Strike belongs firmly in the second category, not because it lacked talent, not because it lacked effort, but because it misunderstood what players valued most about the series. The fall of Rogue Squadron did not happen with explosions, which feels almost ironic considering how many explosions the series contained. Instead, it happened with dilution, through a gradual erosion of focus disguised as ambition. A series once built around elegant arcade flying became increasingly distracted by the need to become something larger, broader, and more cinematic. Rebel Strike stands as the moment that transformation became undeniable. And yet, dismissing the game entirely feels wrong. There is too much craftsmanship here, too much technical brilliance, too much genuine affection for Star Wars. When Rebel Strike works, it still soars. You can feel the ghost of the series at its best roaring through those flight sections, the speed, the spectacle, the immediacy. For brief stretches, the magic returns so completely, you almost forgot what's waiting around the corner. Then the game lands, hands you a blaster rifle, and the spell breaks again. That tension is what makes Rebel Strike memorable 2 decades later. Not as a disaster, not as a punchline, but as a cautionary tale about sequels losing confidence in simplicity. Because sometimes, players do not want a franchise to become everything. Sometimes, they just want to climb into an X-Wing and fly.